A Werewolf Shifter Romance, written by Amelia Hart. Chapter 1. 7 Years in Darkness. The tower stood at the edge of the kingdom like a monument to secrets. Its stone walls had weathered centuries of storms, and within those ancient corridors, something far more devastating than any tempest was unfolding. Serafina had learned long ago not to count the days. Numbers meant hope, and hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. She was 22 years old, though her reflection in the single cracked mirror suggested otherwise. The pale skin stretched across her cheekbones spoke of years spent away from sunlight. Her hair, white as fresh snow, hung down her back in tangled waves that had never known the touch of skilled hands. Her eyes, violet, unusual even for those born with albinism, stared back at her with the hollow recognition of someone who had memorized every flaw, every mark, every reminder of her existence as a prisoner rather than a person. The tower room was circular, built into the northernmost turret of Grimhold Castle. Windows were limited to one small opening barely large enough to fit her head through, positioned high enough that even standing on the ancient wooden chair, she could only glimpse fragments of forest and sky. Walls of gray stone enclosed her completely. The only furniture consisted of the chair, a narrow cot with a thin mattress, and a chamber pot that was emptied once a day by the only human contact she received. Beatrix had been coming to the tower for 7 years now. The woman was older, her hair fading from auburn to gray, her movements slower with each passing season, but her eyes held something that Serafina had learned to recognize as pity mixed with fear. Beatrix would arrive with a tray carrying bread, sometimes cheese, occasionally vegetables, always water. She would set it down on the stone floor, wait for Serafina to move away from it, and then leave without speaking more than a handful of words. "How are you today?" Beatrix had asked once, years ago. Serafina had been too confused to answer, too young then to understand the enormity of her situation. Now, Beatrix didn't ask anymore. She simply came, delivered food, and retreated back down the spiral stairs. But there was something Beatrix didn't know. Something no one in the castle knew anymore. Serafina could feel something moving inside her, something that thrashed against her consciousness in ways she couldn't explain. Dreams haunted her sleep, visions of running through forests, of the ground beneath her feet transforming into paws, of a form that wasn't quite human, but wasn't animal either. She would wake gasping, her heart racing, the fading echo of something primal lingering in her chest. She had tried to tell Beatrix about the dreams once. The woman's face had gone terrifyingly pale, and she'd pressed a shaking finger to her lips. "Never speak of such things," Beatrix had whispered, glancing toward the door as if afraid someone might hear through solid stone. "Never. Do you understand? Your life depends on your silence." That was 7 years ago. Serafina had been a child then, torn from her family, confused about why she deserved this imprisonment. She remembered her mother's face, the way her father had positioned himself between her and the soldiers, the smell of smoke as their home burned. She remembered being dragged away while screaming herself hoarse, remembered the shock of the tower's isolation, remembered the moment when hope had finally withered into acceptance. The prophecy. That was what they called her. That was why she was locked away. Years of listening to Beatrix's whispered conversations and the occasional visitor to the corridor had given Serafina fragments of understanding. There was an old legend about a woman with pale skin and white hair who would walk between wolves and bring about the end of kingdoms. The elders of Grimhold had decided that if such a creature existed, she must be contained. When she was discovered, when the fever destroyed her village, and she emerged from the flames as the sole survivor with her distinctive coloring, the kingdom's nobility had decided her existence was too dangerous to allow. Her parents had hidden her entire life. Serafina understood that now. The isolation of her childhood wasn't cruelty, but desperation, an attempt to protect her from a prophecy that had haunted their bloodline for generations. But the fire had destroyed their carefully constructed secret. She had been found, identified, condemned, and so she existed in this tower, neither living nor dead, waiting for something she couldn't name. Meanwhile, far from the tower's isolation, a different kind of desperation was taking hold in the kingdom. Theron Stormridge sat in the war room of Grimhold Castle, his massive frame draped across a chair that looked fragile beneath his weight. He was 28 years old, a man in the prime of life. Yet something was draining him from the inside out. His amber eyes, sharp as a predator's, were ringed with shadows that no amount of sleep could erase. His once muscular arms had lost definition, and the strength that had made him legendary among warriors was fading, like a river drying in summer heat. He had been Alpha King for exactly 3 years. 3 years of ruling the Shifter Kingdoms, commanding respect from the powerful pack leaders of Valdoria, maintaining order across territories that spanned from the frozen northern mountains to the verdant southern valleys. 3 years of bearing the weight of the crown and the responsibility that came with it. But something was fundamentally wrong. The pain had started slowly, a dull ache in his chest that he'd initially attributed to stress, to the burden of leadership, but it had grown, spreading through his limbs like poison through water. His connection to his wolf, that primal, fundamental part of himself that every shifter carried within, was fraying. The bond between human and beast, which should have been as strong as steel, was becoming gossamer thin. "The healers still have no answers," Bowen said from across the table. The captain of the Royal Guard had been Theron's friend since childhood, one of the few people who could speak to him with complete honesty. Bowen himself was a strong shifter, a beta of considerable power, but his worry for his alpha was evident in the tight line of his jaw and the tension in his shoulders. "Tell me something useful," Theron replied, his voice strained. Even speaking required effort now. Breathing required thought. Existing required willpower he was beginning to question. "There's an old law, from before the written kingdoms, before even the oldest packs had official hierarchies. It's obscure, buried in the oldest texts, but," Bowen hesitated, choosing his words carefully, "an Alpha King cannot rule without a recognized mate. Not just any mate, a soul-bound mate, connected on a level deeper than the pack hierarchy itself. Without that bond established within the first 3 years of an Alpha King's reign, the kingdom's power begins to consume the king from within." Theron had ruled just past his 3rd winter when Bowen spoke those words. The bond with his true mate would have to be forged in days, not months. The timeline lent a sharpened edge to every decision he made from that moment forward. Theron felt something shift in his chest, a strange flutter of recognition. How obscure are we talking? Most people don't know it exists. But the High Healers remembered when I asked them directly. They were checking the old records when you arrived for your health assessment last week. Bowen leaned forward. "Theron, we need to find your mate. We need to find her quickly." The words should have felt impossible, fantastical even. But they rang with the terrible weight of truth. Theron's wolf stirred inside him, dormant as it had been lately, responding to the word mate with something between recognition and desperation. "How do we find someone when we don't even know they exist?" Theron asked. Bowen took a deep breath. "I've been investigating something. There's a record from 7 years ago. A prisoner was brought to the tower. The paperwork was signed by Counselor Edric personally, with orders to remain sealed indefinitely." Bowen's expression darkened. "No trial, no formal charges, just imprisonment under superstition and fear. A prisoner?" Theron straightened slightly, his instincts sharpening despite his physical weakness. "What crime?" "That's the problem. There was no crime. There was only a prophecy, and Edric seemed determined to bury both the prisoner and the truth. But I found something else. The original prophecy in the oldest archives. It's not what everyone has been told. The version people know speaks of destruction, of a woman with white hair and pale skin bringing ruin to kingdoms. But the original text," Bowen pulled a worn piece of parchment from his tunic. "The original speaks of salvation, of a silver moon who would walk between wolves and bring healing, unification, strength to the kingdoms." Theron's wolf responded to those words with a surge of recognition so intense it made him gasp. His vision wavered, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair hard enough to splinter the wood. "There's more," Bowen continued quietly. "If Edric has kept this prisoner hidden for 7 years because he fears what the prophecy actually means, if he knows the truth and has imprisoned someone to prevent it, we have limited time. Edric has spies. If he discovers that I know about the original prophecy, if he realizes that I'm looking for this prisoner, he'll eliminate the evidence. He'll eliminate her." The implications crashed over Theron like a wave. A mate, somewhere in this very castle. A woman who had been imprisoned for 7 years. A truth that someone powerful wanted buried so desperately they would commit murder to protect it. "Where is she?" Theron demanded, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting in his chest. "The tower. The northern tower. The one no one talks about anymore because no one remembers why it exists. But she's there, Theron. And if we don't get to her soon, we might lose everything." Chapter 2. The Tower's Secret. The tower stairs twisted upward in a spiral that seemed designed to disorient anyone foolish enough to climb them. Theron ascended with Bowen trailing behind, and with each step, the sensation growing in his chest intensified. It was unlike anything he had experienced before. A pull, magnetic and primal, drawing him toward something his rational mind couldn't yet comprehend. His wolf thrashed beneath his skin, claws scraping at the inside of his consciousness, demanding to be released. "Theron, wait!" Bowen called from several steps below. "If Edric discovers we're here, then we move quickly," Theron replied, his voice carrying the weight of command. The pain that had plagued him for months seemed to recede with each upward step, as if something fundamental was shifting within him. The ancient stone walls of the tower narrowed around them, pressing inward. Dust particles floated through thin shafts of pale light that filtered through tiny arrow slits. The air grew colder, damper, carrying the scent of stone and something else. Something that made Theron's entire body go rigid. Lavender. Salt. And beneath it all, something distinctly feminine and utterly intoxicating. They reached the tower's uppermost chamber. A single wooden door, reinforced with iron bands, stood before them. Iron bolts secured it from the outside. The outside. This wasn't a prison designed to hold someone trying to escape. This was a tomb designed to bury someone alive. Theron's rage rose like a tide. He was a ruler who had spent 3 years implementing laws that abolished arbitrary imprisonment, that demanded trials before sentencing, that granted even the lowest Omega protection under the crown. And here, within the castle walls he governed, someone had been kept in darkness for 7 years without even the pretense of justice. He reached for the bolts, but Bowen grabbed his arm. "Edric is downstairs. If you open this door, if you're seen, I don't care," Theron said flatly. His wolf was no longer thrashing. It had gone still, focused, its entire being concentrated on what waited beyond that door. "Open it." Bowen produced a key. How he had obtained it, Theron didn't ask, and worked the ancient locks. Each one resisted before yielding with a metallic groan. The final bolt slid free, and Theron pushed the door inward. The chamber was smaller than he expected. Circular, built into the tower's heart. A single narrow window high on the wall provided the only natural light, barely sufficient to see. A wooden chair sat in one corner. A cot with a thin mattress occupied another. A chamber pot, recently emptied, suggested someone lived here. Someone was kept here. And then he saw her. She was pressed against the far wall, her entire body shaking. At first, Theron thought she might be old, worn down by years of confinement, but as his eyes adjusted to the dimness, he realized she was young, barely into her 20s. Her skin was so pale it appeared translucent, as if she had been drained of all color. Her hair was white, not gray with age, but white as fresh snow, cascading down her back in tangled waves. And her eyes, gods, her eyes, were violet, a shade so unusual that for a moment Theron couldn't process what he was seeing. His wolf erupted. The beast had been dormant for months, slowly dying as his human form weakened. But now it surged forward with such violent force that Theron nearly collapsed. His bones ached as if they might transform, his muscles tensed, and his vision flickered between human perception and the sharper sight of his wolf. Heat rolled through him, and for the first time in months, the constant grinding pain in his chest diminished to nothing. He fell to his knees, not from weakness, but from the sheer intensity of the connection slamming through him like lightning. This was no ordinary attraction. This was recognition. This was destiny, ancient and undeniable, announcing itself through every fiber of his being. The woman stared at him with eyes wide as moons. She didn't scream. She didn't flee. She simply pressed herself harder against the stone, her breathing rapid and shallow, her pale hands trembling. "What is your name?" Theron managed to ask, his voice rougher than he intended. She opened her mouth. Nothing emerged but a whisper so faint he almost couldn't hear it. Serafina. Serafina. Even her name resonated through him like a song his soul had been waiting to hear. But there was no time for the luxury of this revelation. Theron forced himself to focus on what mattered most in that moment. Not his own needs, not the mate bond crying out for recognition, but a far more fundamental injustice. He turned to Bowen, his expression hardening. "Edric did this," Theron stated. It wasn't a question. 7 years, Bowen confirmed quietly. No trial, no formal charges, just orders to keep her here until death. Theron looked back at Serafina, really looked at her. She was skeletal, malnourished, her eyes carrying the hollow desperation of someone who had learned not to hope. Her wrists showed marks where she had clearly struggled against restraints at some point. The small window provided no real light, and the cell held nothing to occupy a mind for 7 years. He understood then what Edric had done. This wasn't just imprisonment. This was attempted erasure. This was a man trying to bury a truth so completely that no one would ever know to question it. "Where is Beatrix?" Theron asked. "Downstairs, in the servants' quarters," Bowen replied. "Bring her here. Now." Bowen left without argument. Theron remained kneeling, his eyes never leaving Serafina's face. She watched him as a rabbit might watch a wolf, with terror and a strange, inexplicable recognition. His wolf recognized her completely. His human half was still trying to understand what his soul already knew. "You're safe now," Theron said, though the words felt inadequate for the magnitude of what that statement meant. "My name is Theron. I am the Alpha King of Valdoria, and I promise you, on everything I am, that you will never return to this room." Serafina's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak. Perhaps she couldn't. 7 years of isolation might have stolen her voice as thoroughly as it had stolen her freedom. Bowen returned with Beatrix, and the older woman's reaction was immediate. She rushed past Theron directly to Serafina, pulling her into an embrace and weeping openly. The girl had gone rigid at the sudden physical contact, but gradually she allowed herself to fold into Beatrix's arms, and for the first time in 7 years, someone held her not as a prisoner, but as something precious. "We're leaving," Theron said. Now. The descent from the tower seemed to take forever. Serafina moved slowly, unfamiliar with her legs carrying her downstairs after so long in confinement. Beatrix supported her on one side, Theron on the other. By the time they reached the castle's main level, word of his presence had begun to spread. Servants scattered before them, uncertainty flickering across their faces. Theron led them directly to the central hall. It was his intention to demonstrate that this prisoner, this innocent woman, was now under his personal protection. But he hadn't anticipated the full weight of bringing someone so traumatized into such overwhelming stimulation. The main hall was vast, its high ceilings lost in shadow. Torches burned along the walls, their flames casting dancing shadows. The space echoed with the sounds of castle life, servants moving, doors opening and closing, voices carrying across stone. After 7 years of silence and small spaces, the sensory assault was catastrophic. Serafina's breathing became frantic. Her eyes darted around the hall as if searching for a threat she couldn't identify. When a servant dropped a tray of dishes and the sound crashed through the space, Serafina made a small sound of distress and pressed herself against the wall, her entire body shaking. Theron understood immediately. He moved to position himself between her and the crowd, his presence creating a barrier. The gesture was instinctive, born from the mate bond that recognized her need for protection and was willing to provide it without question. Several nobles who had been observing their strange procession began to whisper. Some looked scandalized, others looked curious. All of them looked frightened. Then Councillor Edric appeared at the far end of the hall. The man's face underwent a remarkable transformation when he saw Serafina. Shock registered first, followed by a flash of something darker, something that looked like fury barely restrained. He approached with deliberate slowness, his voice smooth but edged with threat. "My king, this is highly irregular. That woman is under my protection," Theron interrupted, his tone making it clear the statement was not up for debate. "And she will be investigated for the legitimacy of her imprisonment. I want the complete records of her trial and sentencing brought to my chambers immediately." Edric's expression didn't change, but Theron saw his hands clench slightly. "There was no formal trial, sire. The matter was one of security, concerning a potential threat to the kingdom. A woman has been imprisoned for 7 years without trial." Theron's voice carried the full weight of his authority, the underlying presence of his wolf lending an edge that made even experienced warriors flinch. "That violates every principle of justice I have established. You will produce documentation explaining why this was allowed to occur, or you will explain yourself before the council." Around them, castle inhabitants had gone silent. This was a confrontation they had never expected to witness. A direct challenge between the Alpha King and one of the kingdom's most influential advisors. Edric's jaw tightened, but when he spoke again, his voice had been carefully modulated back to its usual honeyed tone. "Of course, my king. I will gather the records immediately. Though I must warn you, the woman is dangerous. The prophecy can be discussed before the council." Theron cut him off. "For now, she is my responsibility." He turned his attention back to Serafina, who was watching the exchange with wide, frightened eyes. Theron kept his expression gentle, despite the rage burning in his chest. This woman, his mate, though she didn't yet understand what that meant, had been stolen from life by a man motivated by fear and ambition. That would be addressed, but not now. Now she needed safety and time to simply exist as a human being rather than a prisoner. "Come," Theron said quietly, extending his hand. "You need rest and proper food, and clean clothes. Beatrix will attend to your needs personally." Serafina looked at his hand as if it might burn her. For a long moment she didn't move. Then, slowly, she reached out and placed her trembling fingers in his palm. The contact sent another surge of recognition through Theron's entire being. His wolf settled, recognizing its mate's touch as the single thing that could save him from the slow death that had been consuming him. Beatrix guided them to chambers near the royal quarters. Theron ordered the best healers to examine Serafina discreetly, to ensure she had suffered no permanent damage beyond the obvious trauma. He requested that she be provided with new clothes, fresh bedding, and access to hot water for bathing, luxuries she likely hadn't experienced in 7 years. And as he stood outside her assigned chamber later that evening, hearing the sounds of her moving about with something approaching normalcy, Theron allowed himself a single moment to acknowledge the impossible truth his wolf already understood. He had found his mate. The question that remained was whether she could ever accept what that meant, given the horrific circumstances that had brought them together. Chapter 3. Awakening in Shadows. The gardens of Grimhold Castle existed in a state of deliberate isolation from the rest of the fortress. High walls of ancient stone enclosed manicured pathways lined with flowering shrubs and crystalline fountains that caught morning light. It was here, away from the curiosity and judgment of castle inhabitants, that Theron began what he could only describe as an impossible task: teaching Serafina about the world she had never been allowed to inhabit. 3 days had passed since her removal from the tower. 3 days of meals that she ate slowly, as if her body had forgotten the mechanics of digestion. 3 days of Beatrix helping her bathe, carefully untangling her white hair, helping her understand that cleanliness no longer equaled danger. 3 days of sleep that seemed to consume her in great, desperate waves, as if her mind and body were trying to recover years of deprivation in a matter of hours. On the morning of the 4th day, Theron came to her chamber before dawn broke across the castle walls. "Come with me," he said simply. "There are things you need to understand." Serafina was thin, still malnourished despite the food that had been offered to her constantly. Her violet eyes held a wary quality, as if she expected this comfort to be snatched away at any moment. She wore a simple gray dress that Beatrix had provided, and her white hair hung loose down her back, still bearing the slight dampness of recent washing. She followed Theron through corridors she hadn't yet explored, down a set of stairs that descended into the castle's lower levels. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of earth and growing things. When they emerged, Serafina stopped completely, her breath catching audibly. The gardens seemed to stretch infinitely. Morning mist clung to the ground, and the first rays of sunlight were just beginning to illuminate flowering plants that had clearly been cultivated with extraordinary care. Roses in shades of crimson and gold, lavender bushes so fragrant that the scent drifted on the morning air, jasmine trained along trellises, its delicate white blossoms just beginning to open. At the center of the garden stood an enormous fountain, its water sparkling as light touched it. "What is this place?" Serafina's voice was still rough, underused, but wonder infused every syllable. "Sanctuary," Theron replied. "The only place in the castle where we're unlikely to be disturbed. I thought we should use it for your education." "Education?" She looked at him, confusion flickering across her features. "About what you are," Theron said carefully. "About the world that exists beyond the tower." Over the next several days, a pattern established itself. Each morning, Theron would come to Serafina's chamber, and they would proceed to the gardens. He began with the most fundamental information, the hierarchy of shifter society, the distinction between alphas and betas and omegas, the nature of the connection between human consciousness and animal instinct. Serafina absorbed every word like dry earth absorbing rainfall, asking questions that were sometimes painfully simple and sometimes surprisingly profound. "How many shifters are there?" she asked on one morning. "Thousands. Tens of thousands across the territories I govern. Most live in packs, communities organized around an alpha who provides structure and protection. And I am?" Her question was small and frightened. "An omega," Theron said, "which, despite what some believe, is not a position of inferiority. It simply means your nature, your instincts, tend toward different strengths than alphas possess." On another morning, Beatrix accompanied them to the gardens. Serafina seemed more relaxed with the older woman present, and Theron used those moments to speak about the connection between human and beast, about how shifters experience the world through senses that humans could scarcely comprehend. "I don't feel any of that," Serafina said with frustration. "I don't feel a beast inside me. I don't feel different." "You will," Theron assured her, though he couldn't quite explain why he was so certain of that truth. The answer came on the 7th morning, when the full moon hung fat and luminous above the castle, only just beginning to fade as dawn approached. Theron had arranged for Serafina and Beatrix to meet him in the gardens at an unusual hour, just as the sun was beginning to breach the horizon, but before true daylight had established itself. "What I'm going to show you will be shocking," Theron warned, "but I need you to understand what your nature truly encompasses. I need you to see what exists inside you as well, waiting to wake." He moved away from them, finding a clear space between two clusters of flowering trees. His movements became deliberate, controlled. He opened his eyes to meet Serafina's violet gaze one final time, seeing the confusion and trepidation there. And then he allowed his transformation to begin. The change was fluid and complete. One moment, a massive man stood in the garden. The next, a wolf occupied that space, black as midnight, enormous and powerful. The transformation took only seconds, but those seconds held the weight of immense power. His wolf form was magnificent, its fur rippling like water in the early light, its eyes still containing the intelligence that marked it as no ordinary beast. The wolf regarded the two women with an intelligence that transcended animal limitation. Serafina stumbled backward, her breathing accelerating into something approaching panic. Beatrix steadied her with a hand on her arm, whispering reassurance. But then something extraordinary happened. The wolf, Theron, took a single step forward and sat, regarding Serafina with an almost patient expression. And inside the girl, something stirred. It was the faintest sensation, a flutter in her chest, like the wing beat of a bird trapped in a cage. Serafina's hand flew to her chest, her eyes widening as she felt something that had never existed before, or perhaps something that had existed but had been locked away for so long that its awakening felt like birth. "What?" she began, but the sensation was already fading. The flutter became a pressing sensation, as if something was pushing against the interior walls of her consciousness. It wasn't painful exactly, but it was intensely strange. Her vision wavered slightly, and the world seemed to shift colors, become sharper and duller simultaneously. Sounds became overwhelming. A bird singing somewhere beyond the garden walls, the trickle of water in the fountain, the rustle of leaves in the morning breeze. Everything was suddenly too much, too loud, too vibrant. Serafina's knees buckled. The world tilted. For a moment, she thought she might fall, but there was no impact. Instead, there was only darkness, absolute and consuming, as if a door had been slammed shut inside her mind. When she woke, she was in the tower chamber that had become her sanctuary after the castle. A proper chamber now, with windows that opened onto sky, with furnishings that bespoke comfort rather than confinement. Theron was sitting in a chair beside the bed, his fingers steepled before him, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Welcome back," he said quietly. "What happened?" Her voice was hoarse, her head pounding with a sensation that felt like pressure behind her eyes. "Your wolf woke," Theron replied. "For the first time in your life, your inner nature recognized another like itself, and it responded. The experience was overwhelming enough that your body needed sleep to process it. The healers arrived shortly after, summoned by Beatrix. They examined Serafina with careful efficiency, checking her heart rate, her breathing, the clarity of her eyes. They asked questions in low voices, conferring with each other in tones too quiet for her to fully understand. When they withdrew, their leader, a woman named Sestra, with gray-streaked hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, addressed both Serafina and Theron. "Her wolf is deeply blocked," Sestra said bluntly. "Years of trauma have built walls that even a direct encounter with another shifter's animal form can barely penetrate. But the walls are cracking. The waking has begun, but it must progress carefully. If her wolf emerges too violently, without preparation, without trust, it could cause permanent psychological damage. She needs gradual exposure. She needs to learn to recognize her beast, not as a threat, but as an integral part of herself." Over the weeks that followed, the routine deepened. Mornings in the gardens became sacred time. Theron continued his lessons, expanding them now to include not just theory, but experience. He would shift partially, allowing his human form to display the golden eyes of his wolf without complete transformation, demonstrating control and the fluid nature of the boundary between human and beast. Serafina began to recognize the signs of her own wolf stirring within her. A prickling in her skin, a sharpening of her senses, a strange vibration in her bones that came and went unpredictably. She didn't fully transform, but the daily contact with Theron's shifted form meant her own inner beast grew gradually more awake, more aware, more willing to acknowledge its existence. There were moments when her vision shifted to a wolf's perspective, seeing the world in shades and movements rather than colors. There were other moments when she could swear she felt fur beneath her skin, though her reflection always showed her as entirely human. The walls between her and her nature were cracking open, piece by piece, layer by layer, but there was darkness growing at the edges of this sanctuary. Beatrix had begun bringing messages to Theron, coded letters that arrived through channels Serafina didn't fully understand. She caught glimpses of his expression as he read them. The tightening of his jaw, the darkening of his amber eyes, the way his entire frame seemed to go rigid. On one afternoon, when Beatrix had stepped away and Serafina was resting after an exhausting session in the gardens, Theron stared out the window toward the distant mountains. "Edric killed your parents," he said without preamble, his voice flat and terrible in its control. "When you were discovered, he ensured they couldn't speak, couldn't confirm or deny the prophecy, couldn't provide any version of truth that contradicted the narrative he was constructing. He murdered them to bury the truth." Serafina had processed many things since her release from the tower, but this revelation struck something fundamental inside her. Not her sleeping wolf, but something deeper. Some essential part of herself that remembered the woman who had hidden her, the man who had stood between her and danger, the family that had tried to keep her safe. Why? The question was barely a whisper, because the prophecy he was hiding isn't one of destruction. It's one of salvation. A woman with white hair and pale skin who would bring healing and unity. And if the truth came out, if people knew that instead of a harbinger of doom, You represented hope and restoration. His power would evaporate. He kept you imprisoned not out of cruelty, though that certainly existed, but out of fear. Fear that you would become exactly what you're meant to be. Theron turned from the window to face her directly. We have limited time before Edric realizes that I know about his lies. Days, perhaps. A week at most. After that, there's nothing stopping him from eliminating you entirely, from erasing the last piece of evidence that contradicts his version of the prophecy. What do you want from me? Serafina asked, though something in her was already beginning to understand. Your trust, Theron said simply, and your willingness to face what's coming, whatever form it takes. Chapter 4. Whispers of Conspiracy. Weeks dissolved into a rhythm that Serafina had never experienced. Predictability mixed with discovery. Her body had begun to recover from years of deprivation. Her cheeks held color now, her skin less translucent. The white hair that had hung in matted tangles had been carefully tended by Beatrix until it fell in waves down her back. And though her frame remained slight, it no longer suggested imminent collapse. More importantly, her connection to the world beyond her own consciousness was deepening. The gardens had become more than sanctuary. They had transformed into a classroom where fundamental truths about existence were revealed through patient instruction and extraordinary demonstrations. Each morning brought Theron, and, increasingly often, a sense of anticipation that Serafina couldn't quite explain. He would arrive before the castle fully woke, when mist still clung to the ground and the air held the chill of night. They had developed patterns in their lessons. He would begin with theory, explanations of pack structure, the nature of alpha bonds, the responsibilities that came with different positions within shifter society. But theory alone quickly became insufficient for Serafina's hungry mind. One morning, as they sat beneath a flowering tree, Serafina asked a question that shifted something in their dynamic. Why do you spend so much time with me? You're the Alpha King. Surely there are more important matters. Theron considered the question with an intensity that suggested it held greater weight than simple curiosity. His amber eyes, which had begun to feel familiar to her, studied her face with an attention that sometimes made her breath catch. Because, he said finally, some matters are more important than all others combined. The response was cryptic enough to confuse her. But the way he delivered it, with such certainty, such absolute conviction, prevented her from pressing further. Instead, she found herself accepting his presence as though it were the most natural thing in the world. He had become her anchor in a reality that was still strange and overwhelming. It was during these weeks that Beatrix began acting strangely. She would disappear for hours, returning with flushed cheeks and furtive glances. She would bring messages to Theron, folded pieces of parchment that she handed to him with obvious reluctance. Serafina noticed the way his expression would darken as he read them, how his jaw would tighten, how something dangerous would flash through his eyes before he carefully controlled his reaction. One afternoon, when Beatrix had stepped away to fetch fresh water, Serafina gathered the courage to ask what troubled him so consistently. There are people in this castle who prefer lies to truth, Theron said carefully. People who have built their power on deception and are willing to do terrible things to protect those deceptions. Soon, very soon, that situation will need to be addressed. And when it is, I need to know you're prepared. Prepared for what? Serafina's pulse quickened. Something in his tone suggested danger approaching, though she couldn't articulate why. For change, Theron replied. For the possibility that the safety you've found here might be temporary unless we act. That conversation stayed with her. It infected her dreams, made her hyper-aware of the castle's undercurrents. Servants seemed to divide themselves into factions. Those who treated her with cautious courtesy, and those whose eyes held something that might have been fear, or might have been judgment. Counselor Edric appeared less frequently in her presence, and when he did, his expression had taken on a strained quality, as if he were working through calculations behind his calm facade. Then came the night everything shifted. Serafina couldn't sleep. The castle felt different after dark, larger, more complex, full of sounds that seemed to have no source. She had risen from her bed and begun walking the corridors without conscious decision, following instincts she was only beginning to develop. Her wolf stirred inside her, more alert now, more present, responding to sensations that her human consciousness couldn't fully process. The beast within her seemed drawn toward a particular section of the castle, toward voices that were barely audible through heavy wooden doors. She found herself hidden in an alcove, peering through a gap where a door hadn't been fully closed. Inside the chamber, Edric sat with 3 men she recognized as regional pack leaders, alphas who governed territories beyond the castle's immediate domain. The conversation was damning in its specificity. "The girl must be contained," Edric was saying, his voice smooth as oil. "When the Alpha King makes his journey to investigate the rogues ravaging the southern territories, that's when we move. He'll be distracted, away from his power base, vulnerable." One of the alphas questioned this strategy. Why move against him at all? His reforms benefit some of us, certainly, but they've also removed certain convenient traditions. Because he's discovered something, Edric interrupted, and in his voice was a fury barely contained. He knows about the prophecy, the true prophecy, not the version I've carefully cultivated. If he realizes that the girl represents salvation rather than destruction, that she could unify the territories under his rule in ways I can't control, my position becomes untenable. More than that, the kingdom itself becomes untenable for anyone who values power above all else. Serafina's hand flew to her mouth to stifle a sound. They were talking about her. They were planning something that involved Theron's absence, her own containment. "You'll finance the rogue attacks?" one of the alphas asked. "I already have," Edric confirmed. "They're useful tools, disorganized and violent, easily directed by those who know how to manipulate them. Once the Alpha King is distracted by coordinating defenses, we'll move against both him and the girl. 2 problems solved simultaneously." The rest of the conversation became a blur of logistics and betrayal. Serafina backed away from the door, her heart pounding so violently she thought it might tear from her chest. Her wolf was responding to her fear, to the danger, pressing against her consciousness with new urgency. She moved quickly through the corridors, barely aware of her own movements, driven only by the need to find Theron. She found him in his private chamber, still dressed though the hour was late. He was studying maps, marking territories, and when she burst through the door without knocking, he rose immediately, his entire being shifting into a state of alert readiness. "Edric," she gasped out. "He's conspiring. With the regional alphas. They're planning something for when you leave to investigate the rogues. They want to contain me, to use the absence of your authority." Theron crossed the distance between them in 2 strides. His hands found her shoulders, steadying her, his presence becoming an anchor as her wolf thrashed within her, reacting to the adrenaline and fear coursing through her system. "I know," he said quietly. "Bowen has been investigating for weeks. We have evidence. We have witnesses. What we needed was confirmation of timing and intent, and you've just provided that." "What do we do?" Serafina asked. "We accelerate our plans," Theron decided. "We leave for the southern territories tomorrow. You'll accompany me. Beatrix as well. Bowen will remain here to continue gathering evidence, to identify all the conspirators, so we can move against them all simultaneously, rather than just removing the obvious threats. You want me to travel with you? But I've never—" "You've survived isolation for 7 years," Theron interrupted. "You can survive a journey. And more than that, I need you away from this castle, away from Edric's reach, until we've secured the kingdom." That night, preparations began in secret. Theron's inner circle was informed. Carefully selected guards he trusted completely, individuals whose loyalty was beyond question. Serafina was fitted with traveling clothes, sturdy boots designed for horseback riding, layers that would protect her from the elements. She had never ridden a horse before, had never traveled beyond the castle walls, but Theron assured her she would learn quickly. The morning of departure arrived with unusual weather. Clouds gathered overhead, suggesting rain before evening, and the wind carried the scent of distant storms. Their small contingent assembled at the castle's eastern gate, away from the main thoroughfares where Edric or his allies might observe their leaving. Beatrix rode beside Serafina on a gentle mare, her weathered face set with determination. Theron led the group, his warriors bearing commanding respect from even the most seasoned guards. As they began to move beyond the castle's protective walls, Serafina experienced a strange duality. Part of her felt terrified, leaving the only safety she'd found since her release, venturing into a world she barely understood. But another part, the part that housed her awakening wolf, felt something like exhilaration. She was moving forward into uncertainty, yes, but she was also moving away from imprisonment. The tower was behind her. Whatever came next, it would be different. The first day's journey took them through forested terrain, along paths that Theron seemed to know intimately. He positioned himself between Serafina and potential dangers, his awareness perpetually scanning their surroundings. When they stopped to make camp as darkness fell, he helped her from her horse with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the tension evident in his shoulders. "How are you managing?" he asked, as Beatrix moved away to supervise the setting up of tents. "Better than I expected," Serafina admitted. "My legs ache and I'm exhausted, but I don't regret leaving. After tomorrow, you won't recognize the world you've known," Theron said. "Everything changes, but I need you to trust me through those changes." That night, around the fire, Theron explained more fully about mates, the connection between two souls that transcended ordinary bonding. He spoke about recognition, about how a shifter's inner beast could sense its destined partner in ways the human mind couldn't fully comprehend. He didn't explicitly say that was what connected them, but his meaning was clear in every carefully chosen word. Later, when the camp had settled into sleep, and only the dying fire remained to illuminate the darkness, Theron found Serafina standing apart, staring up at the stars visible now that she'd left the castle's enclosed environment. She had never seen the night sky in all its vastness, never understood how infinite the universe truly was. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For believing I deserved more than the tower." Theron stepped closer, drawn by something he couldn't name. His hand lifted, his fingers brushing against her cheek with a tenderness that made her breath catch. For a moment that stretched into eternity, they existed in a space suspended between worlds. Not quite enemies, not quite something more, balanced on the precipice of transformation. Then a guard's voice called from the darkness, urgent and alarmed. "Alpha, we have movement. Something's approaching from the north." The spell shattered. Theron's expression shifted instantly into something harder, more dangerous. His hand fell away from her face, and he turned toward the disturbance, his wolf rising to meet whatever threat was emerging from the shadows. "Stay here," he commanded, "with Beatrix, inside the tent. Don't emerge no matter what you hear." Then he was gone, moving toward the darkness with the fluid grace of a predator, leaving Serafina standing beneath the infinite stars, her wolf trembling inside her with a combination of fear and anticipation for the chaos she sensed approaching. Chapter 5. Blood and Betrayal. The attack came without warning, erupting from the darkness surrounding their encampment like violence given physical form. Rogues emerged from the tree line, their transformed bodies moving with a coordination that spoke of training rather than instinct. These were not the wild, uncontrolled shifters that typically plague the territories. These were organized, directed, dangerous. Theron's guards responded with practiced efficiency, forming defensive positions around the tents. Theron himself transformed mid-stride, his human form surrendering to his wolf in a fluid motion that took seconds. The massive black beast that emerged was a force of nature, muscle and fang and primal authority given shape. He moved toward the attackers with lethal grace, each movement calculated to incapacitate rather than merely wound. One of the rogues, larger than the others, and bearing scars that suggested a lifetime of violence, lunged directly toward the tent where Beatrix and Serafina huddled. Theron intercepted him mid-leap, the two wolves meeting in a collision that shattered nearby branches. They grappled in a tangle of fur and fury, but even as Theron fought, his consciousness registered something crucial. The rogue he faced was shouting, the sounds distorted by his animal throat but carrying intent. "Silver Moon must be destroyed!" the rogue bellowed, his gaze fixed on the tent even as Theron drove him back. "The prophecy demands her death!" Theron's wolf erupted with renewed violence at those words. He threw the rogue away from him with such force that the creature crashed into a tree trunk hard enough to splinter bark. But the damage was done. In that moment of revelation, Theron understood that Edric had reached far deeper into the kingdom than anyone had suspected. These rogues weren't attacking randomly. They were being directed toward a specific target. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes. Theron's guards held their own against the organized assault, but they were outnumbered. Serafina watched from the tent's entrance, despite Beatrix's attempts to keep her back, her entire form trembling as her wolf responded to the violence and danger surrounding them. She felt Theron's awareness of her through their bond, a desperate thread of connection that made her inner beast press harder against her consciousness, demanding release, demanding transformation. Then everything changed. More figures emerged from the darkness. Not rogues this time, but warriors bearing the insignia of organized packs. 3 distinct colors marked their armor, indicating 3 different regional territories. These weren't Theron's soldiers or allies. These were trained shifters moving with military precision, and they surrounded the encampment with the efficiency of a coordinated assault. "The Alpha King is ours," a commanding voice shouted. "Stand down or die." Theron, still in his wolf form, assessed the situation with terrible clarity. The new arrivals numbered at least 30, far beyond what his small guard could withstand. He had to make a choice, and in that moment of calculation, he felt Serafina's terror spike through their bond with such intensity that it nearly dropped him to his knees. One of the new arrivals transformed back to human form, a scarred beta with cruel eyes. "Counselor Edric sends his regards, Alpha King. He's offered considerable compensation for your removal from power. The girl comes with us, however. She has her own appointment with fate." Theron transformed to his human form, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender, even as his muscles coiled with the tension of predators forced to yield. "Take me. Leave the woman and the others. Not your decision to make," the beta replied, gesturing to his warriors. What happened next occurred in a blur of motion and violence. Theron moved not toward his attackers, but toward the trio of warriors approaching the tent. He threw himself into their path, his body becoming a barrier between them and the entrance. Steel flashed, not swords but claws, conjured through partial transformation. A blade of silver, that most dangerous of metals to shifters, scored across his shoulder. The pain was extraordinary, bright and burning, but Theron absorbed it without cry or retreat. Serafina screamed. The sound tore from her throat with a rawness that suggested her wolf was close to emerging whether she willed it or not. Theron felt her anguish amplify through their bond, felt her fear transform into something darker, something with teeth and claws of its own. A warrior broke through and seized her arm. Serafina fought with surprising ferocity, her nails drawing blood from the shifter's face, but she was untrained and exhausted. The warrior dragged her from the tent while Beatrix reached desperately after her, only to be restrained by another of the attackers. "No!" Theron roared, his voice carrying the full force of an alpha command. The word came out guttural, caught between human and beast. He lunged toward them, but 3 warriors converged on him simultaneously. One drove a silver-laced blade deep into his upper arm. The pain was stunning, made worse by the metal's inherent poison to shifter flesh. Another seized his leg, and a third drove a fist into his ribs with enough force to crack bone. Theron fell to his knees, blood pouring from multiple wounds. Through blurring vision, he watched Serafina being lifted and carried toward waiting horses. She was screaming his name, her voice raw with desperation, and through their bond, he felt the moment her wolf finally broke through the walls that had contained it for so long. Her form flickered. Human, then halfway to something else, then human again. The transformation was incomplete, agonizing, a half-shift born from trauma and desperation rather than controlled will. She collapsed against her captor, and Theron felt the full brunt of her pain through their connection. The overwhelming sensations of an awakening wolf, experiencing the world with no training or preparation to handle it. "Get the Alpha King secured," the commander ordered. "We have no orders to kill him yet. Counselor Edric wants him alive for now. The girl is another matter. She's to be eliminated if she becomes too difficult to manage." As darkness threatened to swallow Theron's consciousness, he felt hands binding him, felt silver restraints being applied to his wrists and ankles. His guards had fallen or been driven back, and Beatrix was being secured separately. The last thing he registered before the world tilted and dissolved was the sensation of Serafina being carried away, her wolf howling inside her, with a grief that mirrored his own. But Theron's friends had made their own preparations. Bowen had remained at the castle, but he had anticipated Edric's desperation. The counselor had indeed attempted to neutralize him, sending guards to arrest the captain on accusations of treason. What Edric hadn't accounted for was that Bowen had already moved key pieces into position. He had sympathetic soldiers, men and women whose loyalty transcended politics, who understood that Edric represented a corruption that threatened everything Theron had built. Bowen's arrest became a brief affair. His soldiers intervened before the counselor's guards could secure him, and a short, sharp conflict ended with Edric's forces retreating and Bowen claiming temporary control of the castle's military apparatus. While maintaining the appearance of normalcy on the surface, Bowen worked frantically to gather evidence of Edric's conspiracies. Then a messenger arrived, a scout from the Southern Territories carrying urgent information. Bowen listened to the account of an organized assault on the Alpha King's party with grim comprehension. Edric had moved faster than anticipated. The conspirator had coordinated with the regional alphas and hired the rogues, creating a pincer attack designed to eliminate Theron in the field while removing any evidence of his mate from the equation. Bowen moved immediately. He gathered soldiers, the ones he absolutely trusted, the ones who had sworn loyalty to Theron rather than to titles or politics. He requisitioned horses and supplies, and he began riding south, racing against time itself. He knew the terrain, knew the routes Theron would have taken, and he carried with him documentation of Edric's crimes, evidence that would convince even skeptical observers of the conspiracy's reality. Somewhere in the darkness between castle and battlefield, Bowen rode with a single determination: to reach Theron before the Alpha King died from his wounds, to extract Serafina from her captors, and to ensure that the truth about Edric's treachery reached the kingdom's ears. The night swallowed them all, captive and captor, loyal and traitor, the hunted and the hunter. And in that darkness, Serafina's newly awakened wolf mourned the presence of her mate slipping away through distance and pain, unable to reach him, unable to help him, unable to do anything except feel the slow fade of his consciousness as he lost blood and will simultaneously. Chapter 6. Prophecy Reborn. The dungeon beneath Grimhold Castle had been designed for containment, not comfort. Its walls were carved from bedrock so ancient that they predated the kingdom itself, and the single torch mounted on the eastern wall provided barely enough illumination to see across the small chamber. Serafina sat on the cold stone floor, her back against the wall, her white hair falling across her shoulders in disheveled waves. The chains binding her wrists were not silver. Edric understood that silver would burn her shifter flesh, making it impossible for her to maintain consciousness long enough to be used as a spectacle. These were simple iron, heavy enough to restrain her slight frame, secure enough to prevent escape. Time had become meaningless in the darkness. She had been brought to this dungeon after hours of riding, after being separated from Theron with a brutality that left her wolf screaming inside her consciousness. The newly awakened beast within her was frantic, desperate, clawing at the barriers of her mind with a violence that made her head pound. She could feel Theron through their bond, but the sensation was growing fainter, as if he were slipping away, as if the distance and his injuries were creating a barrier between them that even their faded connection couldn't penetrate. She remembered flashes of the road, wet leather, iron rattling, the sour breath of the guard who rode beside her, and then only the ache behind her eyes when torchlight finally carved the dark into walls. The dungeon door opened, and Edric descended the stone stairs with deliberate slowness. His face held an expression of satisfaction that made Serafina's skin crawl. Behind him came guards bearing torches, their expressions carefully neutral as they secured additional restraints. "Tomorrow at dawn, the kingdom will witness justice," Edric announced, his voice echoing off stone. "You will be tried for witchcraft, for seduction of the Alpha King, for conspiracy against the throne. The sentence is already determined. Execution." Serafina looked up at him with eyes that no longer held only fear. Her wolf had strengthened her, was continuing to strengthen her, even as it remained imprisoned in her human form. She lifted her head with a dignity that seemed to surprise even Edric. "The true prophecy," she said quietly. "You've read it. You know what I'm meant to be, and that's why you fear me." Edric's expression darkened. For a moment, his carefully constructed mask slipped, revealing the desperate ambition beneath. "Prophecies are what we make them. Tomorrow I will make yours a matter of history." He departed, leaving her in darkness once more. The guards remained for a time, watching her with expressions that suggested they weren't entirely comfortable with what was being ordered. But soldiers followed commands, and Edric's authority within the castle walls had remained unchallenged while Theron was absent. Alone again, Seraphina closed her eyes and reached through their bond with every fragment of her consciousness. Theron. Her wolf howled his name internally, a sound of anguish and desperate longing that threatened to tear her apart. She felt him. Distant, wounded, bleeding, but alive. His consciousness remained tethered to hers, though weakly, as if he too were reaching across impossible distances to maintain their connection. "I'm here," she whispered into the darkness, though she knew he couldn't hear her voice. But the bond carried intention, carried emotion, carried the fundamental truth of what existed between them. "Don't leave me. Please don't leave." Through the bond she felt his response, not words, but determination. Pure, absolute, terrible determination. He was coming. Despite his wounds, despite being restrained, despite everything that stood against him, her mate was fighting through darkness to reach her. The hours before dawn passed in a state of disconnection from time itself. Seraphina found herself in a strange space between human consciousness and her awakening wolf's awareness. The beast within her was no longer separate. They were merging, integrating, becoming something new. She could feel the power waiting inside her, coiled like a serpent prepared to strike. Her wolf wanted to emerge, wanted to burst from her skin and run, wanted to find Theron and protect him the way he had protected her. But her wolf also sensed something else. It sensed the prophecy, the truth that Edric had tried so desperately to bury. Her inner beast understood what she was meant to become. When guards came to retrieve her as false dawn painted the sky gray, Seraphina didn't resist. She walked between them toward the castle's great courtyard, where the courtyard had been cleared for an execution that was meant to cement Edric's power and eliminate the threat to his carefully constructed lies. Somewhere in the stunned silence, Theron felt the kingdom's old law settle at last. No longer a hunger devouring him from within, but a current flowing clean through bond and bone. Hundreds of people had gathered, nobles and servants, guards and curiosity seekers. At the center of the courtyard stood a platform with a single post, meant to secure the condemned. Nearby waited an executioner with a blade. Edric stood on an elevated platform, dressed in formal robes that declared his role as judge. He watched Seraphina's approach with satisfaction that was almost palpable. The chains had been replaced with lighter restraints designed for easy removal once she was secured, and guards positioned themselves strategically around her. The morning light was just beginning to breach the eastern walls when Edric rose and began to speak. "This creature stands accused of witchcraft, of seduction, of conspiracy against the throne. Do you have anything to say before judgment is carried out?" Seraphina looked at him, then at the crowd, then upward toward the sky where the first real rays of dawn were emerging. She felt it then, Theron's presence intensifying through the bond, becoming suddenly, shockingly close. Her wolf surged within her, recognizing its mate's approach with a joy that bordered on ecstasy. "I have nothing to say to you," Seraphina replied, her voice carrying a certainty that seemed to surprise even herself. "But he does." The roar that erupted from beyond the courtyard's walls was the most terrifying sound anyone present had ever heard. A wolf, enormous, black as midnight, with fur rippling like liquid shadow, launched itself over the courtyard barrier. It moved with speed that defied natural possibility, clearing the distance between the entrance and Seraphina in seconds. Theron's wolf form was a force of primal devastation, his golden eyes blazing with an intensity that spoke of mating bonds and desperate need and absolute refusal to surrender. He crashed into the guards nearest Seraphina, and they scattered like leaves before a storm. The executioner stepped back instinctively, abandoning his post. For a moment, chaos erupted as soldiers began moving to intercept. But then something stopped them. More warriors emerged from the castle's interior, Bowen leading a contingent of soldiers bearing documentation, evidence, the absolute proof of Edric's conspiracies. The regional alpha conspirators who had believed themselves safe were seized immediately. Edric's face went pale as the reality of his exposure became inescapable. Theron transformed back to human form, blood pouring from multiple wounds that bore the marks of silver. He was in agony. That much was clear from the careful way he moved. But he crossed to Seraphina, and when he reached her, his hands were gentle as they released her restraints. "It's time," he said simply. "He's shown you what you're meant to become. Now become it." The courtyard had gone silent, watching. Seraphina felt Theron's consciousness merge with hers through their bond, felt his strength flowing into her, felt his absolute conviction that she was powerful beyond measure. She closed her eyes and finally allowed her wolf complete freedom. The transformation was agonizing and perfect. Every bone in her body restructured itself. Muscles reformed. Senses exploded outward with a clarity that made human perception seem like blindness. Her white hair extended and reformed into fur, pristine silver white, shimmering in the dawn light, like nothing anyone had ever witnessed. Her eyes remained violet, glowing now with an inner luminescence that was unmistakably supernatural. When her transformation completed, where a girl had stood now existed a wolf of impossible beauty. Her form radiated an ethereal quality, as if she existed partially in the material world and partially in something transcendent. An aura of pale silver surrounded her, gentle but undeniable in its presence. More than that, her very existence seemed to calm the frantic energy of the crowd. The fear dissipated, replaced by something that might have been wonder, or might have been recognition of something primal and good, and fundamentally true. Seraphina, in her wolf form, moved to Theron and pressed her enormous head against his chest. Through their bond, she felt his relief, his overwhelming gratitude that she had survived, that she was whole, that she was alive. He wrapped his arms around her neck, and for a moment, the courtyard didn't exist. There was only two souls, finally together in the way they were always meant to be. Bowen stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had secured evidence of treachery. "Counselor Edric, by order of the Alpha King, and in accordance with the kingdom's laws, you are under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and crimes against the crown. The regional alphas Cormac, Valdris, and Kessler are similarly taken into custody." Edric tried to run, but soldiers had already anticipated that possibility. Within moments, he was secured, his carefully constructed facade crumbling as he realized the totality of his defeat. Seraphina transformed back to human form, exhausted but somehow more complete than she had ever been. Theron immediately wrapped his cloak around her, supporting her weight as her legs momentarily refused to bear her. His wounds needed treatment, but his arms remained around her, as if releasing her might cause her to disappear. The crowd parted as they moved, and in their eyes, Seraphina saw the beginning of something new. Not fear of a prophecy distorted, but wonder at a truth finally revealed. Chapter 7. Truth and Claiming. The interrogation chamber had been deliberately chosen for its coldness, both in temperature and in atmosphere. Stone walls, iron-barred windows, and torches that cast dancing shadows that seemed to mock the truth being extracted from within. Counselor Edric sat across from Bowen, his fine clothing and arrogant bearing having crumbled away like ash. His hands, bound before him with simple iron restraints, shook visibly as Bowen laid out documents one by one. "These records," Bowen stated flatly, his voice carrying the weight of authority, "show payments made from the royal treasury to known rogue leaders over the past 7 years. Your signature appears on every requisition. Care to explain?" Edric's face had taken on a grayish pallor. He was still attempting to maintain composure, but the facade was becoming increasingly transparent. Behind him stood guards, and in the shadows of the chamber's corners, scribes recorded every word for the official record. "By financing attacks against the crown?" Bowen interrupted coldly. "By conspiring with regional alphas to overthrow the Alpha King? By orchestrating the capture of a woman who had committed no crime? The interrogation continued for hours. With each piece of evidence presented, each testimony from captured rogues and regional alpha conspirators, Edric's resistance crumbled. By midday, he was confessing everything. The distortion of the prophecy, the murder of Serafina's parents, the carefully maintained conspiracy that had spanned 7 years. His voice, when he finally spoke the full truth, was hollowed out, devoid of the honeyed manipulation that had once made him dangerous. "I found the original prophecy," he admitted, his head hanging forward in defeat. "Years before she was discovered, I realized what it meant. A woman who could unify the kingdoms, strengthen the shifter bloodlines, bring prosperity through understanding. If such a figure existed, I would become obsolete. My position, my influence, everything would crumble. So when I heard rumors of a child with white hair and pale skin in a remote village, I investigated. When I confirmed it was true, I ensured no one else could use her to challenge my authority." Bowen leaned back, his expression unchanging. "You murdered her parents. They were going to reveal the prophecy," Edric replied without inflection. "They understood what she could become. They would have protected her, raised her to fulfill her destiny. I couldn't allow that." The confession was documented, sealed with the official mark of the kingdom's judiciary. Within days, Edric and the 3 regional alpha conspirators, Cormac, Valdris, and Kessler, were formally tried, found guilty, and sentenced to permanent imprisonment. The execution option was denied them. Instead, they would spend their remaining years in the deepest dungeons of the kingdom, a fate that many considered worse than death. But the interrogation revealed something far more significant than individual guilt. Among Edric's personal effects, hidden in false compartments within his study, were the original prophecy documents. They had been carefully preserved, locked away under layers of security that spoke to their importance. When Bowen brought them before the council and had them read aloud publicly, the reaction was seismic. The true prophecy spoke not of destruction, but of salvation. The silver moon, would walk between wolves and bring unity. She would heal the fractured bonds between packs, strengthen the bloodlines of the kingdom, and usher in an era of unprecedented prosperity. Every word that Edric had distorted was carefully noted and corrected. Every lie that had justified Serafina's imprisonment was exposed and unraveled. The city of Grimhold transformed overnight. Where fear had reigned, wonder bloomed. Crowds gathered in the central square, waiting for glimpses of the woman who was meant to be salvation itself. The nobility, once divided by suspicion and political maneuvering, began to coalesce around a new truth. Serafina wasn't a curse. She was a blessing that had finally been freed. Theron's chambers had been prepared for their union, but first he insisted on privacy with Serafina. She was nervous, her newly awakened wolf thrashing beneath her skin with emotions she was only beginning to understand. They sat together in a chamber overlooking the castle gardens, the same gardens where her awakening had truly begun. "The council wants a public claiming ceremony," Theron explained carefully. "They believe it will solidify the kingdom's acceptance of you, of us. It would be tonight, under the full moon, with the major nobility as witnesses." Serafina's violet eyes widened slightly. "I'm not ready for that," she said quietly. "There are so many people, so much attention. I've barely had time to understand what I am, much less prepare to be displayed." "Then we won't do it that way," Theron interrupted, his voice firm. "I won't force you into anything. We can wait. We can claim each other in privacy, in our own way, and damn the political implications. The kingdom will accept what needs to be accepted." Serafina looked at him, really looked at him, and something shifted in her chest. This man had risked everything for her. He had been willing to lose his kingdom, his power, his life itself rather than abandon her. The depth of his commitment was overwhelming and beautiful and terrifying all at once. She reached out and took his hand, the contact sending electricity through them both. "I want to do it tonight," she said, her voice growing stronger. "But not as a spectacle. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere that feels like ours." Theron smiled, and it transformed his entire face. I know exactly the place. The ritual took place in the gardens, but not in the formal areas where nobles typically gathered. Instead, Theron had arranged for a secluded grove at the forest's edge to be prepared. Only Bowen, Beatrix, and a handful of Theron's most loyal soldiers were present, standing far enough away to provide privacy while still bearing witness. The full moon hung above them, enormous and silver white, casting everything in its ethereal glow. Seraphina wore a simple white gown that fell to her feet, her hair unbound and flowing. Theron stood shirtless, his body bearing the marks of his battles and his wounds, some still healing, others already scarred. The silver injuries had been treated by healers, but they would never fully disappear. They were reminders of what he had endured to reach her. They stood facing each other, and in that moment, the world seemed to contract to include only them. Theron's amber eyes met Seraphina's violet gaze, and through their bond, they felt the absolute certainty of what was about to happen. They transformed simultaneously, their bodies shifting into their wolf forms with fluid grace. Seraphina's white she-wolf emerged, radiant and ethereal, her silver aura glowing softly in the moonlight. Theron's black wolf stood before her, massive and powerful, his presence commanding yet gentle in this moment of absolute trust. They ran together through the forest, following instincts older than civilization itself. They hunted together, moving as one entity despite their separate bodies. They chased and played and celebrated the freedom of their animal forms. And under the silver moon, they moved through the ancient claiming ritual. The dance of mates, recognizing each other not just in body or mind, but in soul. When they returned to the clearing, they transformed back to human form. Seraphina stood vulnerable before Theron, her entire being open to him. He approached slowly, reverently, and when he reached her, he pulled her into an embrace that was both tender and possessive. "I claim you as my mate," he whispered against her neck. Not as possession, but as partner. Not as requirement, but as choice. Before every witness, before the moon, before the gods themselves, "I claim you." Seraphina's response was to tilt her head, exposing the delicate curve where her neck met her shoulder. Theron's fangs extended, and he bit gently at that sensitive junction. Not to hurt, but to mark. The bite left a mark that glowed softly silver, branding her as his mate in a way that transcended physical appearance. It was a mark that would remain visible always, a declaration to the entire kingdom that the silver moon belonged to the Alpha King, and he belonged entirely to her. Seraphina gasped, and then she reciprocated, her fangs finding their own target on Theron's shoulder. She bit with more force than he had, and Theron growled with pleasure at the claiming. 2 marks now, silver and silver, binding them together in the ancient way of shifter mates. When they pulled apart, both wore the glow of freshly claimed partners. The marks on their bodies pulsed faintly with silver light, the manifestation of their bond made physical. Bowen raised his voice to declare the claiming complete, and Beatrix wept openly at the beauty of seeing the traumatized girl she had cared for now standing as a queen beside her king. As the night deepened and the ritual concluded, Theron and Seraphina remained in their private grove, holding each other beneath the moon that had witnessed their union. The future stretched before them, a future that was uncertain, but no longer frightening. They had found each other across impossible odds, had survived betrayal and near destruction, and had emerged not just intact but transformed. The kingdom of Valdoria had its true Alpha King and his queen, the Silver Moon, and together they would begin the work of healing what had been broken and building something better than what had come before. Chapter 8. Silver Moon Rising. 18 months had passed since the kingdom's revelation, and the transformation that had begun with Seraphina's claiming had continued to ripple outward like concentric circles in still water. The castle gardens had become something more than sanctuary. They had become a place of learning and healing, where shifters from across the territories came to understand what the true prophecy meant and how it was meant to shape their world going forward. The woman who had spent 7 years in isolation was now becoming the architect of unity that the ancient texts had always predicted she would be. Seraphina stood in what had once been a formal courtyard, watching as a young rogue shifter, a woman no more than 18, with deep scars marking her left shoulder from silver wounds, attempted to connect with her healing abilities for the first time. The girl's hands trembled as Serafina guided her, but the pale glow that emanated from her palms spoke of potential awakening. Not every shifter possessed healing gifts, but those who did deserved training rather than stigma, instruction rather than fear. "You're doing well," Serafina encouraged, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who understood trauma intimately. She had cut her hair to shoulder length weeks after her claiming, a physical manifestation of the freedom she had claimed for herself. The white locks now framed her face in elegant waves, rather than hanging as symbols of her captivity. Her violet eyes held depths that hadn't existed when she first emerged from the tower. Layers of experience, understanding, and hard-won wisdom. The girl's concentration broke, and the glow faded from her hands, but her expression had transformed from desperate uncertainty to hopeful determination. "It felt different today," she said quietly. "Like it wasn't just energy leaving me, but like I was connecting to something larger." "That's exactly what you're doing," Serafina affirmed. "Your gift isn't separate from you. It's part of your essence. Learning to access it means learning to trust yourself." This conversation represented everything that the kingdom had begun to shift toward under Serafina and Theron's joint leadership. Where Edric's regime had been built on fear and suppression, theirs was constructed on understanding and development. The rogues who had once been hunted without mercy were now offered rehabilitation programs. Those who had genuine capacity for healing were trained. Those who had simply been displaced and traumatized were given opportunity to integrate into pack structures that valued them. The regional alphas who had conspired with Edric had been replaced with individuals whose loyalties were to the crown and to the kingdom's genuine welfare rather than personal aggrandizement. The three conspirators, Cormac, Valdris, and Kessler, remained imprisoned, their confinement serving as permanent reminder that betrayal had consequences. Edric himself had died in his cell 2 years into his sentence, his arrogance finally broken by the reality of permanent consequence. The changes in Theron had been as profound as the changes in the kingdom itself. He still possessed the strength and authority that defined an Alpha King, but the man who wielded that power had been fundamentally altered by his connection to Serafina. Where he had once governed through command and physical dominance, he now sought counsel, listened to perspectives that differed from his own, and made decisions that prioritized long-term stability over short-term control. His generals noted that he was a different kind of leader, not weaker, but deeper, more strategic, more aware of the human cost of his choices. Bowen had become something between general, advisor, and trusted friend. The triumvirate that governed the kingdom now functioned with remarkable harmony. Beatrix, no longer a servant hiding fear behind dutiful service, had become Serafina's closest confidant and the keeper of palace traditions that honored both the old ways and the new understanding. The gardens had remained their sanctuary, the place where they could retreat from the demands of the kingdom and exist simply as two souls bound together by fate and choice. On warm evenings, they would walk the familiar paths, discussing the challenges of ruling, the progress of their various initiatives, the dreams they harbored for their people. And sometimes they would simply sit in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, knowing that everything they had endured had led to this moment of peace. It was during one such evening that Serafina placed her hand over her abdomen and felt the flutter of life moving within her. She had known for weeks, had confirmed it with the palace healers, but this was the first moment she was sharing the knowledge with Theron. His reaction was immediate and profound. Theron's hand covered hers, and through their mate bond, she felt the rush of emotions: joy, wonder, terror, protective fierceness, and beneath it all, a gratitude so deep that it resonated through their connection like thunder. A child. Their child. A being that would carry both their essences, that would inherit the prophecy not as burden, but as legacy. "Are you afraid?" he asked quietly. "Terrified," Serafina admitted. "But not the way I was afraid in the tower. This is different. This is the fear of someone with everything to lose because they finally have something worth holding." Theron drew her close, his hand gentle against her still flat abdomen. "We'll prepare," he said, with the certainty of someone accustomed to meeting challenges head-on. The healers will monitor you, will ensure the birth is as safe as any birth can be. And when our child arrives, they will know a world where they are celebrated rather than condemned. They will know freedom from birth. The pregnancy progressed through seasons of change. Over the next 9 months, the healers charted Serafina's steady course, a winter of careful strength, a spring of renewal, and a summer of quiet preparation, until the equinox drew near. The kingdom continued its transformation. Serafina's healing programs expanded, creating the foundation for what would eventually become formal training academies for shifters with rare gifts. She worked with young Omegas to help them understand their place in pack hierarchies, not as subordinates, but as individuals with specific strengths that deserved recognition and opportunity. Her programs saved lives, transformed communities, and fundamentally altered how shifter society understood itself. The birth came during the autumn equinox, when day and night held perfect balance. It was difficult. No birth is easy, but the child who emerged was healthy and whole. A boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's violet eyes, marking him as something unprecedented in the kingdom's history. The joining of Alpha King and Silver Moon had produced an heir who carried both prophecies within him. They named him Aldrich, a name that honored strength, but also contained softness, reflecting the balance they hoped to instill in their son. The kingdom celebrated with festivals that lasted for weeks, and for the first time in generations, the celebrations were genuine rather than performative, true expressions of joy rather than political theater. Years passed. Aldrich grew into a child who possessed his mother's curiosity and his father's natural authority. He was precocious, intelligent, and unnaturally calm for a young shifter, qualities that the kingdom's advisors recognized as signs of the prophesied one's offspring. But to his parents, he was simply a child who needed to learn and grow and make his own mistakes. On a morning when Aldrich was 5 years old, Serafina found herself in their private garden sanctuary, watching her son play with Theron. Beyond the garden, reforms hardened into law. Counselors signed their names beneath new charters that forbade secret detentions and diverted tithes away from private militias. The South, once bled by paid rogues, now sent its brightest to the healer academies Serafina had founded. In the years that followed, the kingdom remembered. Edric and the 3 regional alphas remained in the deepest cells, their names invoked not with hatred, but as caution. Records of their trial and the restored prophecy were moved into the repurposed Tower Library, open to any citizen who wished to understand how swiftly fear curdles into power. Mercy did not absolve them. It preserved the lesson. The boy was attempting to emulate his father's movements, trying to shift partially, his concentration absolute, despite his obvious frustration with his inability to fully control the process. Theron, patient in a way that only a father could be, guided him gently, never pushing, always encouraging. "Mother," Aldrich called out when he noticed Serafina. "Father says when I get bigger, I can shift all the way." "He's right," Serafina confirmed, moving to join them beneath the ancient tree that had witnessed so much of their journey. She sank gracefully onto the soft grass, her white hair catching sunlight as she settled beside her family. Theron's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with the ease of people who had learned long ago how to move together. Through their bond, she felt his contentment, his sense of rightness with the world, his absolute certainty that they had built something worth building. Aldrich, satisfied with his mother's presence, returned to his attempts at partial transformation, his concentration fierce and determined. And Serafina watched her son, watched her mate, and felt something that she had never believed possible during those dark years in the tower: genuine, uncomplicated happiness. The prophecy had been fulfilled, but not as anyone had originally imagined. There was no single moment of glory or destruction. Instead, there was the quiet revolution of a woman reclaiming her power, of a kingdom learning to see salvation where it had only expected destruction, of 2 souls recognizing each other across impossible odds, and choosing, every single day, to build something better than what had come before. The tower still stood at the castle's edge, but its doors had been sealed. What had once been a prison had been transformed into a library, a place where the kingdom's history, including its darkest chapters, was preserved and studied. Visitors could walk through it now, could see the chamber where Seraphina had been confined, and could understand, viscerally and completely, the cost of fear-based leadership. But the garden was where the true transformation lived. In the garden where a girl learned to trust a man, where mates discovered each other, where a kingdom began to understand what healing looked like, where a child grew knowing only freedom and love, there was the real prophecy, not written in ancient texts or whispered in cryptic riddles, but lived daily in the choices made by people determined to build something better. The silver moon had risen, and in her light, the kingdom was learning to see itself clearly at last. The end.